It's something I personally am really fascinated in. As a farmer, or a part-time farmer myself, we have a herd of Welsh black cows in southwest Wales, and it's amazing to put them out into the field and just see how they will just naturally forage for what they need, and to see that the use of trees with cattle is something that's been going on for so long, time immemorial, and yet it's something that we've stopped, and we've really cut that joy out for cattle and for pigs and other animals. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this morning. And Steve, take it away. There's the lectern. I think you're going to stand and talk, aren't you? So I'm going to move over. Steve's going to talk briefly. Well, good presentation. Then there will be time for questions after and throughout. So if you have any questions, just put your hand up. We've got some roving mics. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Great.
Cheers. Great. Everybody hear me okay? Too much? Well, good morning. It's a real honor to be here and to join you. I come from the U.S. in New York State. Really grateful to be here and experience this conference with you all, and really grateful for my wife, who's back at our farm tending to the sheep, so I can be here, and the ducks and all the things that we do at our farm, which I'll share a little bit about this morning. But I want to talk about silvopasture mainly today, and I'll be here throughout the conference. So if there's conversation, we'll have a panel tomorrow on silvopasture. There's a lot of silvopasture here, so I hope to lay some groundwork and some foundation for that conversation to continue on. So let's get going here. If it goes, there we go. So I think we need to start big picture and at this conference and think about a solar economy, a solar agriculture. So in every 2 minutes, the energy reaching the earth from the sun is the equivalency of what we use in a year as all of humanity. It's pretty remarkable to think about that. It's pretty remarkable to think about all the things that we've built with it. But a lot of this building, a lot of this modern building has been built off of fossil energy, right? Borrowed sun that's been stored in the earth that we've pulled back out and built our civilizations from. And on our farm, we like to use solar panels. We have solar panels on the house and the barn. We use solar panels to electrify the sheep net and all of that. But this is a good use. This is a good way to capture solar energy, have it for use on the farm. But we really can't compare to these cells, these solar cells. These are the stomata on the leaves of a tree or on the blades of a grass. These have been under development, under technological innovation for centuries. And we really can't rival their efficiency in the world. And so we want to build a foundation off of this. This is actually how we've built a foundation of agriculture and built a foundation of civilization for most of human history. It's only recently that we started using those borrowed credits that were buried in the soil in fossil energy. And so what are the building blocks? Who's doing it well? Who's on the cutting edge of this technology? Trees are. And I think a lot of us have affinity, and we like to be around trees, we like to be in the woods. But we struggle to figure out ways that we can put trees on our farms, knowing they probably have benefit. And silvopasture offers us one of the best ways to see the benefit and to put trees on farms. Trees need partners, mycorrhizal fungi. This is a slide of a white pine seedling from the University of Aberdeen, who's done a lot of great research on mycorrhizal fungi, showing that the mycorrhizal fungi, which is the lighter, thinner masses in here, are extending the tree's root system 75%. And the fungi are responsible for breaking down the nutrients and the minerals and capturing water and bringing all those things to the tree roots and trading those things for sugars that the tree is photosynthesizing from the sun. So trees need fungal partners. So we have trees, we have fungi. Trees are, of course, slow, long-term storages of carbon, and they store most of their carbon above ground in the woody mass. So we could contrast that with grasses. Grasses store most of their biomass, most of their carbon down in the soil, both in the root systems of those grasses, as well as when those grasses are grazed, the carbon that's sloughed off into the soil. And so we have a great carbon storage potential above ground and below ground if we can bring these two elements to our agricultural systems. But of course, these grasses, they need a partner as well, and that's where the grazing herbivores come in. This is the cutting edge. This is also the oldest technology on Earth to cycle grasses, to cut these down and cycle that material back into the soil. And so we need all these pieces together. Trees, fungi, grasses, and animals. If we look at the ecosystem out there, these are the things that are doing the work of collecting all of that solar energy and putting it into productive use, creating all these amazing things. So fruits and nuts, leaves, seeds, all sorts of different things. If we look historically, what's ironic about silvopasture is that silvopasture used to just be called farming. So we've named this thing only recently that has existed for most of the time, and this is what humans have been familiar with, the idea of bringing animals and wood and grasses together. So this is a painting from the 15th century, a French painting showing the practice of pannage. And pannage is when pigs would be brought into a wood only during the season of mast, when the acorns or other nuts are dropping to the ground, beech nuts, things like that, and would allow those pigs to clean up. And this just produced some of the finest pork in all the land. Hello? There we go. Take you to, this is the island of Kyushu, southern Japan. These are 300 to 400-year-old coppice systems with sawtooth oak, where the foresters here, the small landowners, the farmers, cut these trees on a 15 to 20-year rotation, and they're using these trees primarily for shiitake mushrooms, shiitake production. And in between, of course, 15 to 20 years, these are on rotations, maybe a half-acre clear cut at a time to regenerate the coppice. That's land that's not providing a profit for the farmer. That's land that needs to be managed, and that's land that needs fertilization. So what do they bring into these systems? What have they been doing for 300, 400 years? They've been bringing cattle in. And the cattle will fertilize, will provide some income for the farmer, and will actually eat some of the oak leaves, which are high in condensed tannins. They provide a bit of a medicinal benefit to those animals. And research at Kyushu at the experiment station showed that the cows actually helped. They didn't damage the new coppice shoots if they were stocked at the appropriate level and left for the appropriate amount of time. So they can actually help a bit in the pruning process. If we go to Spain and Portugal, we have the dehesa and the montado. These are systems that have been around for 400 or 500 years in persistent use as grazing operations, where we have these oak savannas, either acorn-producing oak or cork-producing oak. And these savannas provide this space. And most often we think of running pigs through here, these famous Iberian pigs that produce the famous Llaman Iberico, the fine smoked acorn-finished pork product. But actually these systems are most commonly and grazed most of the year by merino sheep, because most of our food is in this grass, which the sheep can utilize. The pigs really are only brought in during that acorn harvest time of the year. And I think the thing that is not told, because we all love to eat smoked pork products, or some of us do, at least I do, is the cultural aspect of the dehesa and the montado. So the montanza is a community event where the pigs are harvested, they're celebrated, their intestines and everything is washed in the creek, and there's ceremony and there's prayer. And this is a community event to bring people together. And so there's a cultural element to this type of silvopasture as well. Right here in Britain, we have plenty of examples of pannage and of small woodland use, common woodland use. I'm very excited while I'm here. I'm going to take a hedge laying workshop, which is something, we have plenty of brush back in the US, but we don't have any hedges, and we could probably benefit from a lot of them. These are old skills that are remnants in the landscape that we need to capture and hold on to. Really important if we're going to work with livestock. So I come from New York State. It's a bit hard to see the map, but New York City is down, down in this corner. I'm right in the center of New York State, about 4 hours east of New York City, near a small town called Ithaca. And we are in Haudenosaunee. We're in Cayuga Nation land. You may be familiar more with the Iroquois, but they like to be called the Haudenosaunee. This is the traditional lands of these people who still live in the state. And we have to wrestle with the complex history of that aspect as we farm on this land. But we live in this land, and the Cayuga and the Haudenosaunee were incredibly agricultural people. And while We wouldn't call it silvopasture. They didn't traditionally have domestic livestock. What they did do is use fire to open up the landscape for grazing herbivores, create good habitat, something we would call silvopasture today. And they would use fire to do this. So, of course, all of this has changed. We have these historical examples. Each of those examples, from Japan to Portugal to Spain to here in England, all have shifted. They're all remnants. There's memories of them in the landscape, but they're not easy to find. And part of the reason for that are the two C words. We have colonialism, we have capitalism. And what colonialism and capitalism brought was we need to do more with less, and we need to value things. We need to put things on a scale and say these things are more valuable, these things are less valuable. And unfortunately, in that process of sorting that out, trees and forests were put on the unvaluable side, and open land, plowable land, tillable land was put on the valuable side. And actually, it turns out both have value. But we have this mentality now ingrained in our agriculture where good land is cleared land, good land is tillable land. In the US, when they assess our taxes for agriculture, you're taxed at a much higher rate for tillable or arable land. Woodland is considered wasteland. It's not considered valuable for agriculture. It's reflected in the ways our governments run, in the ways we think about these things. And there's a real loss there. There's a real idea that we have separation between forest and field, that we have separation, and that we own property privately now, which is not something those historic systems were a part of, private ownership of land. In Japan, that farm that I showed you pictures of is part of a community land trust. In the Dehesa and the Montados were common lands, right? We have stories in the UK of common land ownership. This is, again, my home. I live in here. Post-Revolutionary War, when the land started to be chopped up into square blocks, which had nothing to do with the watersheds, with the ways that the land flowed into the lakes that are so characteristic to where I come from. If you were to compare this map with the Haudenosaunee territories, the Haudenosaunee are lined up exactly with all the watersheds. Not surprising. So we've taken this mentality a bit far, I would say, especially in the US. We're really leading the edge in confinement operations and hiding our animals more and more from consumers because it's frankly embarrassing how we raise them. And with confinement feeding, this was really post-World War II, especially when we applied the tools of war to the landscape.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Just to say, I've just remembered, I'm terribly sorry, I was so excited to see you all, but I forgot to mention there is a fire alarm test in about 2 minutes. So I'm so sorry. I just thought I'd interrupt to say that. Thank you. I've actually got a whole list of things I was meant to say to you, but I got excited and I totally forgot. But I'll say them all at the end. But the most important thing is at 9:20 and at 9:30, we're lucky enough to have 2 fire alarm tests this morning. So looking forward to that. So I just wanted to let
Try
you
to emphasize that, the right point.
You don't all need to run out, I don't think, unless I see smoke, and then I'll definitely let you know. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but soon there will be 2 very loud, obnoxious noises.
Cool.
Great.
Thank you. So, World War II, we applied this war technology that we created to agriculture. And in the US, my grandfather was a corn farmer. And at that time, post-World War II, he could grow a few acres of corn and bring it down to the mill and make some good money. But he saw just in about a decade's time the get bigger, get out, and he decided to get out. But we overproduced corn, and then we decided the animals needed to eat it, even though they weren't designed to ever eat corn in the first place. And then we decided it was easier to bring it to them and put them in these confinement operations. And they've turned into some pretty interesting, maybe what we might call works of art. This is a photograph of a feedlot in Texas. You can see the pens up in the left corner, and the photographer is, let me find his name here. It's, well, we'll find him later if you're interested in that. But this is the lagoon that pours off of these feedlots. It's creating a real, obviously, environmental problem in its wake. And I just found this article in researching for coming here. This is in May, where this phenomenon is coming to the UK as well, where they found about a dozen feedlots showing up in the landscape. So we have a big hill to climb in the US to move away from this. About 95% of our livestock are in confinement operations, but I think you have a better chance here to push back against this kind of thinking. So let me tell you a little bit about our farm. because at the end of the day, this is where I like to be, this is where I like to spend my time. I think most people get into farming because they just want to spend time outside and enjoy themselves. And these are our sheep grazing in a silvopasture. And I always say to new livestock farmers, I work for the extension at Cornell University, so we're educating new farmers all the time. I say, if you're a new livestock farmer, your best tool is a chair. And you just take that chair out to the pasture and you sit in the pasture and you watch your animals. And depending on what type of animals you have, you're going to have different experiences. But you're going to notice that each animal seeks out something in the landscape different from all the others. And each animal has a different requirement to balance their diet. And that's going to change from day to day and even hour to hour over time. And if you don't learn how the animals interact with their environment, how they eat, how they wrap their tongues around the grass and pull on it if they're cattle, or how they rip it off if they're sheep or goats. If you don't understand how they browse woody material, you're going to miss out. None of that information is in a book. That's something that's only found on the landscape. So we have our sheep here in a silvopasture at the top of the hill there. The top of the slide is black locust, one of my favorite silvopasture species. This is just a test. At the bottom of the hill here we have willow, probably my second favorite silvopasture species. And so these trees are in the pasture. They provide shade, they provide shelter, and they provide fodder. That's probably the most important. They provide nutritious and medicinal food for the sheep, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what we look for in our paddocks is not a similar experience, but actually something unique each time we move our animals. We move our animals about once a day in the peak of the summer. And you can see in here, some of these animals are looking for clovers in the grass, some are looking for some of that bluegrass or timothy, and some of them are going right for those black locust trees, which if we control their access to, we can actually allow them to feed off of them without too much damage. And those trees are incredibly resilient as well. And of course, as those animals fill their rumens, they're looking for a place to bed down and hang out. And in the hot summer months, turns out their favorite places are in our hedgerows or in those places that provide that nice cooling shade, because we have solar collectors that are casting shade and also recirculating water through the air. And so this is the place where the animals want to be. And you'll see this in a farm where there's just one lone tree in the pasture, and on a hot summer day, all the animals are crowded underneath it trying to get that access. Very different type of experience. In 2016, we had the most severe drought on record in central New York. So this big blotch here in the middle is where our farm is. This was called D4 drought. So incredibly severe, incredibly low rainfall. We did our rotation. We have about 45 paddocks on the farm. We did our spring rotation. We got back to the first paddock, and there was no forage for the animals. I hear you had a summer like that here this year. That's a panicking moment where you realize your plans that you wrote through nicely in the winter didn't really work out in reality. And farmers around us were draining their ponds to irrigate their pastures. They were driving outside of this zone to find hay or silage to feed their animals. It was a real panic moment. On our end, we were lucky enough to have this, what we call the goat sheep. These are Katahdins. This is a breed that was bred in Maine. Incredibly cold hardy breed, very parasite resistant, but also a bit goat-like in that they prefer actually the browse material just as much as the grass material. And so we decided to just kind of experiment. We realized that we had about 8 acres on our farm. Our farm's about 50 total acres, 20 hectares. So, about a quarter of our farm were these abandoned hedgerows and scrublands, places that the previous farmer had just let go fallow. And we realized there's an incredible amount of food in there, and why not just fence the animals in and see what happens? And it was quite biblical if you're into that sort of thing. It was 40 days where they were off pasture and in the hedgerows, and they completely thrived in that space. They actually loved it because it was a hot, dry summer, so they were in the shade, they had plenty of food. At the end of the season, their weights were no different than in a normal grazing year. So this was a wake-up call for us, and we kind of lucked out. In that first year, too, a little hard to see the slide here, but this is a willow hedgerow that we'd planted. Again, I had no intention of feeding this to the animals. I spent the first part of my life as a conservationist protecting trees from grazing animals, and here I am giving them access to them. But we realized we needed to feed anything possible to these animals, and this was before I knew that willow, with its high condensed tannins, can balance the rumen of the animal and actually reduce some of the parasite persistence in there, and also can reduce the methane output from burping, which is a big critique of grass-fed systems, is that these animals are producing a lot of methane. Well, if you feed enough condensed tannins, you can actually reduce that impact. So before I even knew the medicinal benefits, I was just looking for anything green to feed to these animals. And so we put them right in here, and you can see the trees were tall enough, this was only 3 years after planting, that 2/3 of the green material was above browse height, and so they could strip the lower parts of the tree. They could eat that vegetation without doing long-term damage. And this is where we started to really get excited about fodders and tree fodders. So on the flip side of drought, that was 2016. 2018, we had this year one of the wettest years we've ever seen on the farm. And while our grasses responded pretty well to that initially, it was very quick that they actually were oversaturated, and we had some decline in production as well. And so this is a map showing we have a 71% increase in heavy rain events. These are the top rain events. We don't have rain in small increments anymore. It's in 1-inch, 3-inch, 5-inch events. It's in minor flooding events. We had flood warnings almost every other day this year. And I see that this is something that's a bit bleached. This is the map of the UK here, where it shows over time at least a 30% increase in precipitation. We're all going to have a lot more rain as a general pattern, but we're also going to have those seasons of high drought coming down the pike. This is climate change. It's not all going to get warm. It's not all going to get dry. We're in wet climates that are going to get wetter. So from that perspective, from a resiliency as a farm perspective, I'm excited about trees, and silvopasture offers a lot of solutions to those things. But then on the bigger scale, we talk about carbon sequestration. We talk about what types of agriculture are actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back into those long-term reserves. And I mentioned at the top of this, we have the trees doing the above ground work, and we have the grasses and the forbs and the legumes doing the work in the soil. And there's a wonderful book called Drawdown. Paul Hawken was the editor. It's an international collection of scientists who assessed and did all the math and the calculations to say, what are our solutions to global warming? How do we rank them? We're going to rank them in the top 100 solutions. And it turns out, and these aren't just agricultural solutions, so one of the top solutions, for instance, is reducing our food waste. That's like number 2. If we just wasted less food, we'd actually do quite a bit to reduce our carbon footprint. But out of those top 100, silvopasture ranked number 9, and it was by far the top solution for all of farming, all of agriculture. And there's already 350 million acres of silvopasture being practiced worldwide, mostly in tropical climates. And so the question is, could we grow it to 550? And that would reduce our CO2 substantially. It would really make a dent in the problem. And the reason here, this is some research in Canada that really just shows that silvopasture compared to pasture is about 3 times more productive in terms of sequestering carbon. So we know managed grazing has benefits to carbon. But as soon as we add trees, we triple that benefit. And this is when we plant trees into pasture as part of silvopasture. So with these pieces that we're trying to manage, the question is, what is our role as farmers? So I like to think of us as like an orchestra conductor. We're not here to tell these things what to do. We actually can't play the instruments for the animals. We can't play the instruments for the grass. They all know their instructions. They all know what to do. We're here to bring everything together, and just like an orchestra, make sure it's in the right place at the right time. That's really our goal. So let's talk about a few of these things. And all this information is here, and it's in the book that I wrote, because what I try to do is pull together what it is, and what I realized was we just need to take a couple pieces like baking a cake. We need to have some good grazing with a little bit of good forestry, with a little bit of good animal husbandry, and that's silvopasture. This is something that's easy to do. We just have to build those skill sets. So let me ask you a question out there. When does something count as rotational grazing? If I move my animals once a month, is that rotational grazing? How about once a year? How do we know when something's rotational? It's not simply moving them from one space to the next. What are we looking for as our indicator of success? Anyone want to shout it out, or? What's that? Diversity? Okay, that's part of it. What's our indicator of good rotational grazing? Soil health's a good long term. How do I know when I walk out in the field with my lawn chair that it's time to move the animals if I'm going to sit and watch? The height of the grass, right? So what happens in the pasture is our animals seek out material and they clip it off. And again, somewhat biblically, on the third day, all of those clumps of grass and all of those clumps of clover start to resprout and put on new growth. So if we graze our animals in there for a month, what happens is every third day they go and they eat that same clump of grass, that same clump of clover, and over time, everything diminishes. We lose that, and that's why when you drive by paddocks where animals have been in there for months and months, what's left? Thorny thistles, right? Nothing that looks good to a grazing animal. So 3 days is kind of our max to leave an animal in a place before we need to move it on and let these grasses rest and recover. That's the biggest part. If you're not up for rotational grazing, then don't add trees in, because that's another level of complexity. So what's key is, we have to start small. When we had our first few sheep, the first season, we had pretty small paddocks. It wasn't reasonable to move them every day. We moved them every 3 days. And we size the paddock based on the number of animals. We do some math, there's some calculations, but we also do a lot with our chair. We do our observation and we learn the landscape, and we move the animals when the instincts feel right. But a good rule of thumb is we put our animals on when it's about 10 to 12 inches, about this yay big. I know I'm in the wrong place to be talking about inches, but we can do the conversions later. And then 4 inches or so, we move them off, or by the third day. That's where we can start. There's a little bit more nuance to it, but we can start with that. This is not silvopasture. All right, we call this woodland pasture in the U.S. And I think it's called wood pasture here as well, where we put animals into the forest, and we really haven't thought much about. We haven't created the conditions for much forage to grow, and so the animals root around and dig and scrape trees if they're grazing animals, and tend to do a lot of damage. All right, so when we're doing silvopasture, we're actually very precise about when they're in, when they're leaving, how much food is on the ground, and how much tree cover there is. In many cases with a woodland, we need to open up the canopy to about 50% canopy cover to let enough light in to get those forages established. And we actually would put some energy into establishing those forages before we put the animals in. If we just put them in here, probably in the long term, we're going to do a lot of damage. There's a lot of pasture in the U.S. that people say, oh, I'm doing silvopasture, but they're not managing that forage level, and so in most cases they're doing a lot of damage. Then we got to do the woodlot and the trees, and this is something that is one of the lost skills. Foresters have kind of taken forestry and said this is a sector that is for professionals only, at least in the U.S. that's how it is. But we need to have common sense forestry prevalent in our farming, especially if we're going to do silvopasture. And you all have I'm so excited to be here and experience and visit some places where pollarding and coppicing exist, where you can, I'm looking for a billhook, if anyone can help me find a billhook, because it's impossible to find those in the U.S. So the skills and the tools aren't even available if we want to practice this small woodland management, but these are the types of things that we have to be bringing back into common practice. They should be as familiar to us as using a shovel or something like that. So this is black locust in New York. This is a tree native to North America. This is a tree that is 70% of the forest in Hungary, because the Hungarians back in the 1700s realized the value of this tree to grow incredibly fast, to fix nitrogen, and to provide rot-resistant posts. So the farmer's saying is if you put one of these posts in the ground for a fence, the way you measure if it's ready to be replaced is you put a rock on top of the post, and if the rock decomposes, it's time to replace the fence, all right? So this farmer here is harvesting and thinning this woodlot. He's making enough posts to fence his entire farm. He has a 300-acre beef operation, and now he's selling the posts. He fenced in his whole farm, and now he's selling the posts to the surrounding farm. So he's making quite a bit of money off of these trees. And these are ready to harvest in 5 to 10 years, depending on your soils. So really rapidly growing, really successful species. So let's value the wood for more than just timber potential. There's so many small products out there that have potential to incorporate into our systems. One thing we've learned on our farm, it's really easy. Sometimes you buy a bunch of trees and you look up their final spacing, how far apart they're going to grow when they're nice big trees. Well, that's not how trees grow in the wood. In the wood, trees grow really densely and then thin themselves out over time. And so we have much better success when we actually plant quite close together. This is about 1 meter apart between these trees. So we plant seedlings really close together, and then we allow them to grow nice and straight and tall, and then we thin them out over time. And some of them self-thin because their genetics just aren't suitable for the conditions or for the site. So this was in 2013, one of the rows we planted on our farm. And this is, again, black locust in 2017. So over 30 feet tall in just a few seasons. And these trees don't really seem to care if it's a drought year or a flood year. They look brilliant. They look beautiful no matter what. They provide nutritious, incredibly dense food for animals in either of those conditions versus the grasses, which tend to really ebb and flow with the different conditions. The other piece with the woods is to start on your farms, and what we're doing on our farm is starting with what we would call the most marginal land, kind of the most overgrown, whatever the last farmer forgot and stopped managing and is often overgrown with lots of lovely, thorny, brushy things you probably can't even get through in many cases. We have several acres of that on our farm. This is really the place to start playing and learning because the risk factors are much lower. We don't start with silvopasture in our nicest wood. We start in something that's a bit overgrown, needs a bit of regeneration and care. And it's been amazing to see how the animals and a little bit of hand tool work and sometimes some mechanical tool work, how that can transform these spaces in just a few seasons. And again, these are areas that we often save for that midsummer grazing period where the cool season grasses out in the pasture are really slowing down and where the animals really want to break from the heat. And they become more and more valuable every year on our farm. So the third piece of this triangle is the animal care. And I think we're missing a big part, especially when we put animals in a confinement situation. We're not appreciating what a friend of mine, Fred Provenza in the US, calls the natural animal body wisdom. And this is the idea that animals actually have the ability to find in the landscape, if they're given the opportunity, the nutrition, the medicine, all the things they need to balance their diet. And that, I'm not sure how common it is here, but I work at Cornell University, and they do have the animal science department. And what a lot of people do in the animal science department is they calculate what they call TMR, which is total mixed rations, which is the idea that we can formulate the perfect diet for an animal to gain weight at the perfect time. But that causes all sorts of problems, and Fred Provenza's research, which spans 40 years in Utah, shows that every animal on every single day of the week has a different dietary need, a different dietary preference. And the only way we're going to provide that is by providing diverse food for them in their landscape. Fred just came out with a book called Nourishment, which I really recommend. He also, along with Michael Muret in France, followed a bunch of shepherds around and wrote this wonderful book several years ago, The Art and Science of Shepherding. And while most of us probably don't have access to the land to become shepherds, there's a lot of lessons in how shepherds think and read the landscape and apply that to their animals that can really apply to our own grazing system. So one example is what's called meal sequencing, that it's actually important when animals get different types of foods. So high legume foods, high condensed tannin foods, the main course, which are the grasses. The sequencing of these can actually be important, and that can have influence on how we rotate our animals through our pasture. With our animals, we have to think right place, right animal, and right time. These animals all have wonderful qualities to put into the landscape. They could also do great damage and great harm if we put them in the wrong place at the wrong time, all of them. So we've been thinking about this really critically, and I think they all have their own place, so we have to think about how to match them to the right scenario. So I'll share a few places here. This is a cider orchard close to our farm, as our friends run this, and they were looking for yields on their farm while those cider apples were starting to mature. So that's, the first 10 years of the farm, there's nothing but taking care of a lot of trees and crossing your fingers and waiting for apples to show up. So they looked for some earlier income streams, and they also looked at some of the needs of the apple trees for fertilizer and pest control and these types of things. And so they brought in turkeys as a way to help with that. They also grow asparagus in between the rows of the cider trees. And there are a ton of pest challenges with asparagus, and it turns out that turkeys are the perfect solution to all those pest challenges, right? So these are income streams they got in years 1 through 10. Now they're transitioning out of asparagus and out of turkeys, and they're just going to do their apples, right? And here's on our farm, we have a small orchard, and we really like poultry and orchard seems to be a very good match. And I have a friend up the road who just has geese in his apple orchard, and he doesn't mow at all during the summer because the geese actually weed the grass. If you get the right density of geese at the right time, they won't damage any of the trees, and they'll keep the orchard nice and mowed. And guess what? All these animals are also cycling and fertilizing, right, at the same time. Click. Here's some Icelandic sheep. This is in Minnesota, so in central northern U.S. Very cold climate, extremely cold climate. This fella is breeding some very cold-resistant nut trees. These are hickory trees, pecan hybrids. And he uses the sheep to mow prior to nut harvest because his grasses are this tall and he's going to lose all of his nuts down in those grasses. So that's how he uses the Icelandic sheep. So again, he's not looking necessarily for the fiber or the meat or other products. He uses them as an ecosystem service, and that's beneficial enough on this farm. Here's goats being used actually at a U.S. Navy base, cheers, and using them to reduce the impact of some invasive plants on this hillside. And now I'm hearing that in California, Google has actually hired a herd of goats to take care of some of their land. And California is also using goats to maintain the medians in highways, to maintain some of the brush in there. Much more cost-effective and better for the environment than mowing and clipping and all of that. Sleepy? Cheers, thanks. This is my farmer friend up the road who has, I mentioned the Black Angus farm. And so this is a plantation that he saves just for his summer. What he finds is his open pastures dry out and slow down. He tends to like to let those rest in the midsummer, and he puts his animals into the silvopasture. And so this helps us balance out what's interesting about grasses underneath this type of tree cover. And you can see here pretty widely spaced trees allowing enough light to come in. And black locust is also wonderful because the leaf structure allows light to penetrate well to the forest floor. The grasses in here, actually, one of the concerns with this is that you're going to have a reduction in yield. What tends to happen is there's actually less overall biomass, there's less volume, but the quality actually increases. It becomes more dense, essentially, because the leaves actually broaden out as they're seeking more sunlight because they're in partial shade. So the cool season grasses, especially, which tend to kind of peak out in the summer underneath these silvopastures, can actually continue to grow and offer really high-quality forage. So you're really not getting much of a loss at the end of the day. And there's a lot of research to show the benefits of that and how that can work. And then I found this researching for us for this talk, seeing what's going on in the UK here. If you haven't seen this, it all seems like it's free online or on YouTube. Tales from the Wild Wood was put out a few years ago. And this fellow basically goes through, I think it's about 6 or 8 episodes, gives some good example of how to restore. This is a wood in somewhere in Wales, Strawberry Cottage Wood, I think it was called, where he's doing restoration work and starts to go through some of these pieces, especially on the forestry end. But he did use pigs in there, and I think it was a really good example of how pigs can be used in an extreme scenario where there might be something very persistent where you can't get forage established. So in this case, he had a significant patch of bracken fern and used the pigs in one instance for one season to help clear out that bracken fern so then forage could be established. It is hard to maintain pigs on a perennial basis on a landscape because what they want to keep doing is digging up the soil. But pigs are incredibly beneficial when we think about renovating spaces. So I want to talk to you a little bit about fodder. I want to know if there's any questions that are burning for folks that we want to answer at this moment. I'll take a pause. Anyone? I think you raised your hand and there's a fellow with a mic here.
Sorry, I mean, why don't they just kill the trees? Why don't they just ring bark them? I would have expected that to happen immediately.
You mean any animal? Or
anything grazing just goes for the bark, in my experience.
So it's a good point, and it's kind of something to drill down into, is when we think about the trees we're going to select, and we think about the impact, one question is, do they have a history of browse adaptation? The second thing is, we don't put the animals in right away. The trees need to get tall enough so they're above browse height, at least a majority of the vegetation. And the bark also needs to harden off enough. So in our case, our goat-like sheep can't strip it, because they will. And when the trees are too young, what we found with the black locust is in the 2nd and 3rd year, the bark was starting to harden off. It wasn't quite hardened, but in the 4th, and now the 5th, and next year will be the 6th year, it's hard enough that they won't actually strip the bark anymore. We tried alder on our farm. We were really excited about potentially alder as a fodder species. We haven't found that the bark will harden off even after 6 or 7 years enough to prevent that scraping from the animals, right? So we do fence them out in the beginning, and there's an important consideration with how we lay out our silvopasture. That's why we like rows, because we can fence them out with our fencing. And then we can slowly integrate them back in when they're ready. But they do have to be ready, yeah. Otherwise, they will go for them, absolutely. Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Steve, do you mix varieties of trees or just plant the same variety?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about some species in a minute here, but I started with a list this long in my notebook, and now I have a list about this long. And so I'll talk about some of the criteria for that. But definitely a diversity of species is really important to have, yeah. What I do recommend, though, from our experience is within a row or a cluster, do the same species. Think about diversity on the field level or on the farm level. If you start to make a row of trees and it's a locust and a willow and a poplar and they're all mixed, they're all going to grow at different rates. They're going to be really hard to manage, but if you do same species by cluster, then you can manage the cluster in the same way, which can be really important. Again, if we want to get the animals back in, if I have willow here, I might have to wait a bit longer, but if I have all the same species, then they can be integrated much quicker. Yeah. In the back there? Yeah?
Thank you. Did you introduce any grass species? Did you sow any grasses, or did you just let whatever you found flourish?
So when we're establishing silvopasture, what we tend to do is see what shows up first, because that's the cheapest, and we're cheap. And generally with rotational grazing in these soils, there's often a seed bank that can get the grasses to show back up. Well, we actually find we need to establish more of the legumes. We usually have a very low legume count, and so we really like the process of frost seeding. I don't know exactly when that could happen here, but for us it's in about February or March. Basically when we're starting to move into the thaw, the winter thaw. If we throw down legume seed, it has a very hard seed coat, and the freezing and thawing, it's usually during the sap season, is going to work those seeds into the soil. And so we can actually broadcast and frost seed and get that kind of seed to soil contact that we need. So we most often bring legumes into the system and let the grasses be what they are. Yeah, cool. Cool. All right, we'll keep going here because I want to share some trees. I think these are really important. One of the things in the book that was so central for me was what tree species, and this is the question I get asked the most, what tree species should I think about? So you have to think about your own criteria, but I'll share the ones I started to think about from my experience with silvopasture. And these were the kind of main criteria, and I thought of it like a sieve, and I pushed all the trees through the sieve, and a few came out the other side, all right? So there's other species you could potentially incorporate, and I'm always interested in hearing what people are thinking based on some of these things. So I was interested in, does it have research out there as a fodder? Does it have clear nutritional value? Is it adaptable, meaning pretty much anywhere in the cool temperate climate would this tree survive and thrive, all right? Is it fast growing? And the reason for fast growing is I want to get it above browse height so I can get my animals back in with those trees, all right? And so while I'd love to plant oaks and walnuts, and we have some of those on the farm, I don't feel like we have time to wait 15 or 20 years or 50 years right now for maturity. I want something that in 3 or 4 years or 5 years I can get my animals back in with. What we realized early on in the farm is we need to have these trees easy to propagate because it gets very expensive, and sometimes you can't even find the material to buy the trees. And so I think part of a silvopasture farm has to be a tree nursery. And so most of these trees are incredibly easy to propagate on your own. And then hopefully having some secondary products as well that have some value to the market. So here's the 4 species that fit through the sieve. And I know 2 of them are native to the UK, and 2 of them you'll have to have conversations about, you know, how you want to involve with them. Black locust is a real controversial tree in the US, partially because it's so persistent, it's so fast growing, it tends to send out root suckers, it can really invade a field, they like to say. A lot of the folks I fight with about this. But the thing with grazing is that those suckers actually get grazed off, and so we can actually keep the trees exactly where we want them to be. But I find black locust having so many positive advantages that it's really one of the critical anchors, I think. And if we know about good grazing, what's really interesting about these species is they mimic the perfect pasture mix almost ideally. So when we think about kind of a baseline nutrition that our animals need, maybe 75% of their food is coming from grasses in the ecosystem, and then maybe 15% or so is coming from legumes, high protein forages, and then maybe 10% is coming from really nutritiously dense forages. We call those the forbs, the flowering plants, right? The medicinal plants. What's interesting is that willow and poplar are essentially analogous from a nutritional standpoint to grasses. Black locust is almost nutritionally exactly equivalent to alfalfa, which is one of our higher protein nitrogen fixing forages. And mulberry is one of the most nutrient dense trees out there. So we have our grasses, our legumes, and we have our forbs. All right. What's really cool in the grasses column is that willow is very high in tannins, as I mentioned before, so we get a benefit to the rumen health. We have a reduced parasite persistence in animals that are getting exposure to condensed tannins, versus the poplar, which is really something the animals could pretty much eat all day. The condensed tannins tend to limit how much the animals can intake, so they can't eat their entire diet off of willow. Mulberry is so predominant and interesting in that its high digestibility allows even pigs and poultry to utilize this as a major feed. And in China, they pelletize mulberry leaf as a feed for livestock. So if we're going to start a silvopasture, I would say these are our best bets to really get off and running really quick. And all these trees we can plant, and in just a few years, we can put these right back with our grazing animals. So I mentioned with willow, so many different types of species. We talked about high condensed tannins, rapid carbon sequestration. So back to carbon. All this above ground biomass is usually double underneath the ground of really ropey, woody material. It's a pretty long-term storage of carbon. So these are some of the best trees actually when we start to think about carbon sequestration. They're also incredibly good at, because they have such dense fibrous root systems, at absorbing and filtering pollution, nutrients that might be running off of farms. And they're the only tree I know of you can literally take a stick and cut it and stick it in the ground and it'll grow a tree. It's really that simple. Cut it during the dormant season, maybe a month before it's going to break dormancy, and stick it in the soil. What we find is they take very well. This is a condition, this is a swale that we put on our farm, so it's a very nice conditioned bed. You can stick the trees in there and they'll take just fine. If you're going to put it in a harder, more compact soil, we like to start these in pots first and then transplant them. Give them a bit of a start for the roots. This is in Canada, where this is being used as a biomass filtration system. This is runoff from a potato field. What they were finding is these trees would capture pretty much 95% of all the phosphorus and nitrate runoff, and they would use that to fuel their growth. And this farm was actually using this as biomass in a digester to then provide electricity for the farm. So this is Prince Edward Island. The sound is just out here. So the government was paying for these willow buffers to prevent that pollution from going into the sound. And it turns out the farmer was able to capture all of that in the willow and then turn it back into electricity. Poplar's basically willow. It's just a different form. They're close relatives. And what's cool about poplars, they'll grow at the highest elevations. These are poplars in Colorado up in the Rocky Mountains. They'll grow at the lowest, driest places on Earth as well. These are cottonwoods in the desert that just get a little bit of water every time there's a flash flood. So incredibly adaptive species. Black locust is an incredibly fast-growing, nitrogen-fixing. This is a black locust coppice, just 1 year's growth on those trees. Really incredibly fast. It's an incredible firewood as well. It's actually so hot that we melted one of our wood stoves with black locust. And we sent a picture to the company in Sweden, and they said we'd never seen anyone melt the baffle. But it's incredibly high heat. You have to be careful using too much. But this is probably in one of the best potential cash crops as people look to put up fences and fence out their gardens. All the farmers around us that sell black locust posts usually have a year wait list at this point. So I think this is a really important tree to be considering. It's also an incredible bee plant. So these are flowering trees. They're pea flowers. Again, the entire honey industry in Hungary is essentially based off black locusts, because it basically, the research that the trees were brought over there again in the 1700s and basically have shown up in the woods so prevalently that they exist in this forest. So if you're a beekeeper, wonderful tree for that. And the mulberry, as I mentioned, both the fruit and the leaves having really high value for animals and livestock. This is the hard one for us. It's really hard to find good mulberry tree stock, but it's something we're working with some nurseries to propagate and grow out and figure out which one of these might be the most nutritious for our animals. This is a fodder block of mulberry in South America, where they'll literally run the animals through here. They can do it twice in a season because they're in the tropics, but we could probably do it once a season. So a fodder block, the idea is you plant these really densely, you prune them, so they essentially are a feeding station for the livestock, and then you send them through once a year. And the farmers at this farm are getting 2 crops of fodder harvest and 1 crop of fruit harvest from the system. But in our cold climate, we can probably only do it once. We have a bit of a shorter season. So finally, and then we'll take some questions, everyone's like, that's cool. Does silvopasture pay? Is this going to work? How do I justify this in my farming system? And what I say to folks and what I work with farmers with all the time back in the States is building good enterprise budgets for grass-fed livestock systems. That's how we're going to base this. That's how we're going to work this in. I hope someday that we have not just grass-fed, but maybe forest-fed or tree-fed products. But we'll start with grass-fed. And this is a report, I can share it with folks if anyone's interested. It's called Back to Grass. This is a US one. Just to show you, our demand domestically is more than doubling every year for grass-fed beef. And farmers are getting about 70% more of a premium price over conventional beef for grass-fed. Most of our grass-fed beef right now comes from New Zealand and Australia, who very long ago, post-World War II, actually decided that grazing was the way to go with livestock, and actually openly and very actively promote willow and poplar as important animal feeds, and will pay people to plant them. So maybe we can get our governments to do that. And of course, here right at home, you have a wonderful guide from the Pasture for Life folks who are here at the conference. I'm excited to be on a panel with them tomorrow. We'll keep talking about silvopasture and really good case studies and good economics to talk about grass-fed. So I think that's the way that we think about the economics for silvopasture. All right? So thanks so much for your attention. I'd love to take more questions in the few minutes we have left. I guess we'll do the mic.
Fascinated by the mulberries. Had huge trouble establishing them in Sussex. Don't think they like wind very much, but are you talking black? I see your pictures are of black mulberries, but in China with a white mulberry that they're using commercially. So which is the one that you use in the United States, and which is the more resilient? And do you know anyone in England who's tried it? Because I think what you need is a sunny spot with almost zero wind to get them to establish. That's my experience.
And you're saying the black, yeah?
Black, I'm after the fruit, greedily. I didn't know you could use them for fodder. That's fascinating to me. I was just after some mulberries for breakfast.
Yeah, mulberry is the one of those four that has the most work to do. Most of the species we're using are the whites and the reds. And the red mulberry is very cold tolerant. That's the piece. But one of the breeders I work with is like, well, we need to keep working. We can look at crosses. We can look at breeding to improve that. You think about all the work that's gone into apples or tomatoes or something. If we had that work, we would have a black mulberry that was cold hardy, right? So part of the work may be to do that. But I would say for the climate you're working in, maybe some of the reds would be something to think about. But potentially the whites as well. Yeah, we've had the best success with reds at our place. Yeah. But keep us posted. Right. Yeah. One of the questions with mulberry, though, is less clarity research-wise on the nutritional differences between the three. With willow, there's 400 species of willow at least, and the nutritional quality and the condensed tannin varies with different species, and so there's open questions about which ones to choose and put into our farms. Yeah. So, Salix purpurea, the osier willow, the basket willow, those common ones are really good basic one. There's also one, it's a hybrid cross. I usually blank when I'm speaking to remember the cross name, but it's a Japanese hybrid willow. If you find me later, we can look it up and talk about it. Yeah, cheers, thanks.
And then one there.
Great.
There, yeah.
Have you experimented much with cutting tree hay for winter fodder, and do you think it could replace the need for high mineral feed blocks over the winter?
That's a great question. So the question is about tree hay. I have started to experiment with it, and there's a farmer friend of mine up in Maine who's also doing tree silage. This is actually harvesting leaf material and putting it into plastic and basically fermenting it like we would with silage and having good success. And so there's potential. The question is about efficiency of harvest, really, not if there's nutritional benefit, but how we could efficiently collect that material and store it, right? Because I can stack hay bales in the barn is one thing, but clusters of branches is a different thing. So questions there. The biggest piece for tree hay, that's the place in the world that's been most successful are in drier climates. Like in Africa, tree hay is really common, but that's because you can pollard a tree and stick the hay right in the top of the tree, and it'll be fine because there's no rain, and then it's fed during the rainy season. Right, so we have to collect it, store it, stick it in the barn, all these kind of things. But I'm curious. I'm really interested. Yeah.
Great. Time for one more question just here.
Great. I'll be here a couple days, so we can keep chatting.
It might be one question passing off as two. So the first one is you have a clear rotation for grass on the third day. For something that's really fast growing like willow, how intensively can you browse it off before it starts to lose its energy for regrowth? And my second question is, if you were going to design a silvopastoral system from scratch, what is your favorite layout?
My favorite?
Layout, arrangement.
Okay. Great questions. All right, so firstly, these are great questions, and I don't have all the answers to these. These are things we all have to collectively work on. So what we found is in the spring we have too much grass to feed the animals. We're always trying to play catch up. In the summer is where we have the slump, and that's when we tend to feed our trees to the animals. Also, we know that in the growth of leaf development in a tree, there's different nutritional qualities throughout the seasons. Where our farm actually applied for a grant this year to try to do nutritional content throughout the season. And that's what I'd recommend is we need more data about what does it look like in spring versus summer versus fall. But there's probably a point in time when it makes sense. And I think that trees in the cool climate, we would start with maybe one browse a year, and we want to never harvest more than 50% of the material. We want to have some left for the tree to continue to grow. But we're not going to be like in South America where we can do it 2 or 3 times a season. But there's questions there because one of the things that Fred Provenza found is that when trees resprout and regrow after browse, the nutritional content's actually higher. So it gets into a much more detailed question about management, and the answer is we don't fully know. We have to start looking at these species and kind of tracking that over the season. So I'll pause that one there. The last one. Layout. So we learned very hard. We like rows. We like to be able to use our temporary net fencing or the single strand fencing and keep the trees out. And so we have our paddocks and we have rows of trees, often along contour if it's on a slope, and we fence them out. And then once they grow up and we can incorporate into the paddock, we'll move our fencing. We'll incorporate one row of trees and we'll plant our new row of trees. So we like rows at big spacing, and then we can fill in the gaps over time. And we found with sheep, 60 feet, so 20 meters or so is about right. And with cattle, we probably need to go a bit bigger with those rows, or else they get a bit bottlenecked and don't really graze and utilize the paddock as much. But I'd love to keep talking about those questions. Those are great things to drill down into. Thank you so much.
Steve, thank you so much. Fantastic, folks. So before you all go, just have a few very, very, very quick announcements which will be useful, I promise. If you're tweeters, please tweet hashtag ORFC19. That's hashtag ORFC19. Please also note the session times this morning, that the breaks are much shorter than last year, but there are more sessions fitted in. Just to let you know about the Right Honourable Michael Gove, who's coming back again this year. Michael Gove will be speaking in here, but the session will be live streamed from the Assembly Room, which is literally out of here, directly across there, the old library and the Christopher Room. So if you can't fit in here, please take advantage of watching it being streamed. Lunch will be available to buy, it's changed a little bit, will be available to buy in the church from 11:30 until 3, from 11:30 until 3. And in the parish centre there will be 4 working lunches. And that's 2 today and 2 tomorrow. And the working lunches are basically an opportunity to get to know people a bit more and to have a sort of a more intimate conversation about something you're interested in. And they're all listed in your programme, so that's 2 today, 2 tomorrow. You can get soup and bread there at those lunches. Finally, the toilets are downstairs, so they're along the corridor on the town hall, and there's also some in the church and outside of the Christopher Room. Finally, please check your fire exits. The muster point is outside the front of the church. If you need any help or any assistance, there are ORFC volunteers dotted everywhere in orange t-shirts, and I hope you have a wonderful conference. Thanks, everyone.